Okay. The clock is two in Finnish time, so I think we will start. Welcome to the first session of the Nils Klim webinar series. I particularly would like to welcome our speaker today, Professor Eva Josefsen from the Arctic University of Norway. The topic that we have today is settler state responsibility, recognition of violations, and redress to Indigenous peoples, the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission in focus. A few practical details before we start. This webinar series is financed by the Nils Klim Prize, and it's organized together with the ERC-funded research project From the Margin to the Center, Rights Development, Transitional Justice and Indigeneity in the Nordics, or short MARCEN project. As you may have noticed, this webinar is recorded and it will be published on the MARCEN website and on YouTube. A little bit about our speaker today, Professor Josefsen. Thank you for joining us. You are a professor of social sciences at the Arctic University of Norway. And Professor Josefsen has researched democracy, political governance, and public administration. And you have also led the research project Truth and Reconciliation in a Democratic Welfare State, the Indigenous Sami, the Kven Norwegian Finns minority, and the majority in Norway, or short, TrueCom, which was a research project that was active between 2020 and 2024. And it focused on the recent Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So welcome, Professor Josefsen.
Yeah.
It's good to have you here. My name is Daniela Latinolo. I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Turku, and I'm also the project leader of the MARCEN project. For all of you here today, you can ask questions. We have some questions from the MARCEN project team to Professor Josefsen, but there may also be a chance to take a few questions from you. So you can ask questions via the chat, and we may have time for them at the end of this webinar. And when asking questions, please be mindful and respectful of others. So, but now I would really like to turn the attention to you, Professor Josefsen. First, I would like to give you a chance to contextualize the title that we have today in the seminar. So, settler state responsibility, recognition of violations, redress to Indigenous peoples, focusing on the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So what contexts do you think that we should be particularly mindful of here?
I was especially thinking about the term settler state because it's a term that should be discussed in a scholarly framework. I'm not going to do that here, but just to point out that it is a term that isn't straightforward necessarily, at least not on the Norwegian side. And that is due to the fact that the Sami people have over centuries been living together or coinciding with the Norwegian population, the Norwegian settlements along the coast, especially from the Sami traditional living areas from below Trondheim, the city of Trondheim, also in the south, and into northern Norway. So there have been a coinciding settlement along the coast, and this was the situation up till the northernmost part of Norway, where we can maybe talk about settler. The county of Finnmark and part of Troms, We had the settlers coming over from the northern Sweden and Finnish side, so the Kvans, who came a couple of centuries ago, and upwards. And so that wasn't a state-driven settler situation. But the Norwegian state had a policy from the mid 1800s, late 1800s, and into the 1900s, where they had a policy of an active policy of a settler state, you might say, financing immigration from the south to settle in Finnmark in terms of agriculture. Activism activates, so settler in agriculture.
Thank you very much, Professor Josefsen, for that contextualization. And that's, of course, a very important context to discuss. And always when using these kinds of critical concepts, it's important to discuss what we mean with them. And they might indeed mean quite different things in different contexts. So thank you for that specification. If we go to the focus of the TrueCom project and the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, looking at the final report of the Commission and the Norwegian Parliament's decisions, and also the budget allocations that have happened in the aftermath of the final report and the Parliament decisions. How would you assess the Norwegian state responsibility for its historical Norwegianization policies or assimilation policies? And is there a gap between the decisions made and the funding? And if there is such a gap, what does it suggest about the Norwegian state's approach to implementing reparative measures?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I'll start to answer it by addressing the Norwegian Parliament, the Storting's decision. So that was a significant point in the process. So the Norwegian Parliament decided upon 17 points in an apology of the Norwegianization policy and the consequences, and also measures. So including the apology, there were 16 measures that related to language, culture, and the general society's lack of knowledge. So that was the content of these 17 points. And relevance to language or regarding language, it was concerning education, linguistic arenas, financial framework for municipalities, etc. So they were pointing at education as a significant measure, and also to establish a competence center strengthening the knowledge of public employees and require the government to report annually also to the follow-up. That is an interesting point, that the government has to report about how they are going to follow up this work, both yearly in connection with the state budgets every fall, every autumn, and also every fourth year a bigger report on how they are following up. So then it is interesting then to see to discuss what do this apology actually mean? How can we understand the apology? So it can be understood, of course, as an apology as such, but it can also be understood as encompassing the Norwegianization as outlined in these 17 points or in these 16 points. And if it's a broad apology that includes all of the assimilation policy, or all of the Norwegianization policy, that is more than the 17 points. So then you have to really see because the parliament doesn't say anything about how they understand the Norwegianization policy. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in their report do discuss that, or at least say something about how do they understand what the Norwegianization policy is, how can we understand it? And they say several things actually, but I'm going to pick up two ways of understanding it, and that is two approaches that isn't necessarily the same. So the first one is where the Commission says that the Norwegianization was to be understood as assimilation. So they said that the Norwegianization policy is the Norwegian version of assimilation policy, and then they continue, which is a political program targeting linguistic, ethnic, and religious minorities. And they say further, the Norwegianization policy can be defined as targeted as a state targeted in terms of state, regional, and local measures aimed at making groups to give up their language and cultural characteristics and replacing them with Norwegian equivalents. That's the one way of defining it. That definition doesn't give any explanation about the Samis as an indigenous people and the national minorities, the Kvans and the Norwegian Finns and also the forest Finns that was included after a year. The Commission included them after a year. So that definition of assimilation doesn't give any explanation of the two different groups in terms of indigenous status and minority status. So, but further on in the report, several, well, I think, I'm not quite sure, I don't remember the page, but there is another explanation or another definition of Norwegianization policy where they say that the Norwegian policy was that the same was not the same towards the indigenous Sami and the Norwegian clans, because, as they say, there are two pillars. The one pillar regards the right to language and culture. And the Commission say that that pillar is common for indigenous Sami and national minorities, but they are not identical. So that's the first. So here they said, the Commission say that these rights to language and culture are common, but not identical. In addition, the second pillar that the Commission points to is the pillar of land and water, land rights. And there the Commission say that pillar has been reserved for the Samis as an indigenous people. And the two pillars of rights has implications when looking into what the Norwegian Parliament apology and the 17 measures actually include. So, and to put it very simple, the pillar number 2 concerning land rights are not mentioned in the Norwegian Parliament decision, neither in the apology or in the 16 points. And then I come to the budget. So the Norwegian Parliament had the report, decided upon the report in November 2024, and in October 2024, and in last year, November 2025, the state budget was handled in the Norwegian Parliament, and there you could expect that the budget should mirror these 17 points, and maybe even the second pillar. However, it wasn't very much funding. It was approximately 6 million to cultural measures, film and art. There were 2.5 million to the Sami Parliament in terms of including a new municipality into the language area, management area. And there was 7 million to investigate or to plan the organization of a national competence center, and a few more, but not really much. Not really much. So, of course, financing measures is an important part if you are going to talk about reconciliation, because the Norwegianization policy was really about economy. So the Norwegian Parliament really financed the Norwegianization policy in terms of schools and management and well, all over the society, from municipalities to schools to land. Yeah. So of course, finance is important, and that is why the limited financing of these measures is interesting. But of course, there is also other measures that doesn't necessarily need financing. So that is why the report that the government is to give at the next budget, Parliament budget in this year, in the fall, is going to be interesting. So what are the government going to report on? Are they just going to report on these 16 points? Or are they also going to report on measures that we can find, or descriptions of the situation and the consequences that we can find in the TRC report? That we really don't know. So that's going to be interesting in some over the summer sometimes.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for developing on that. And I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned this, the two pillars also, and the if I understand you correctly, a kind of a tension between the two pillars. And if we look at the Norwegian Parliament's decision and these 16 points that you mentioned, but also I think the Commission's mandate and focus, the focus has been quite a lot placed on language and culture, whilst issues regarding land rights, social policy, or child welfare, for example, have not really been addressed to a great extent. If we think about when it comes to acknowledging harm, how should we look at this kind of selective acknowledgement of harm, and could this have consequences for addressing historical and maybe also contemporary injustices?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In my opinion, selective acknowledgement of harm will, of course, affect trust, for example. So how can the minorities and the indigenous Sami, how do they look upon the Norwegian Parliament's position concerning Norwegianization policy if a significant part of the Norwegianization policy isn't addressed? So that is absolutely a consequence, and it may even be interpreted as a continuation of harm and unjust. So a continuation of a Norwegianization policy, even though the government or the parliament doesn't necessarily say so. So they don't explicitly decide upon furthering the Norwegianization policy, but it can be interpreted that way. And there have been voices in the media that are voicing that interpretation of the lack of acknowledgement of harm, both concerning land rights and also other sides that are not addressed. Today, or maybe it was yesterday, there were a newspaper article, an interview with a reindeer owner here in the county of Finnmark, who talked about the consequences of wind turbine in reindeer grazing areas, and the consequences in terms of health, psychological health, and that this should be addressed when planning that kind of change of use, and or when it is debated, it should be addressed alongside other consequences prior to that kind of activities or plans. So yes, and it's also interesting to see when it comes to the apology and the Norwegian Parliament 16 points, that this really hasn't, it's not the first time the Norwegian parliaments are fairly selective in terms of how they understand the state's own history in terms of the Samis and the clans. At least when it comes to the Samis, because in 1963, and that's some decades ago, the Norwegian Parliament discussed the Sami Committee proposal. That was a proposal that was forwarded in 1959, and they already then the proposal proposed a new policy, both in terms of Sami language, culture, but also territorial issues and legal issues. So rights to land and rights for both reindeer and agriculture and fisheries. And also in 1963, the Norwegian Parliament were selective in terms of what suggestions they discussed and decided upon, and what suggestions they just sort of ignored or didn't bring into the debate. And there again, it was the land rights that was left outside, and also legal issues. So if you see this is in a historical perspective, you can see that there is a need for also addressing land rights, and even more so when the new industries are coming in and pressing out the traditional users. Sami traditional users, and especially reindeer is now affected. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that answer, and for talking also a bit about the consequences that this kind of selective recognition of harm can have also today. And placing this, I think, in a historical context is very important, and looking in at the final reports and the actions taken by the Norwegian Parliament and decision makers, sort of a continuation of a historical negotiation, maybe, or recognition, or in some cases also failures to recognize Sami rights. I'm thinking about you already addressed a little bit when talking about these two pillars and the definition of the Norwegianization process in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, and particularly in the final report. But how did they define Norwegianization, and how do the concepts of assimilation and colonialism shape the Commission's understanding of reconciliation also? So not just truth, but also reconciliation. And then I'm wondering also, maybe this also goes back to the tension between language and cultural rights on the one hand, and land rights and other rights on the other. But what kinds of injustices do you think are more fully recognized? Are there injustices that are only partially addressed? And might there be harms, if we talk about the consequences today, might there be patterns of harm that persist today?
Yes, well, as I already said, as long as land rights and new industries entering into traditional land, as long as that isn't settled, I think that is part of a harm that is going to continue. So just to conclude on that. If we, for example, bring up the Fosen case, I don't know if you are familiar with that, but it was the wind power plant at Fosen, and accepted by the Norwegian government and established, and then they went to court, and the High Court ruled that this was a breach to indigenous human rights. Yeah, but still the Norwegian government didn't act on that. So Sami activists had to mobilize and demonstrate to get the government to actually acknowledge that this was the case. And they didn't even apologize, and they didn't act before, well, they were pressured in terms of activists and civil disobedience action. So that is part of the history of Norwegianization, and how this is present in the state structures, in acts, in decision making processes, who are significant stakeholders. What position do the right holders have on the other side is a question that is very much, in my opinion, highlighted, for example, during the Fosen case. And now we have other wind power plant plans, and also who has been who are all present, but still in the court system. So this is a huge a huge obstacle when we talk about the reconciliation. So, but you asked about the assimilation and colonization, and how did that sort of I don't remember quite how you said it, but how can we understand the Commission's reconciliation, as I understood your reconciliation
yes,
perspective, so to say. Yeah. So assimilation, absolutely, you can read it through the report. So assimilation in terms of language and culture, absolutely. Education, absolutely. There are chapters on health and social policy, child welfare. They have written about that. Also fishery, reindeer, agriculture, and so on. Discrimination. There's a lot of topics that are handled or talked about, written about in the report. It is, however, unfortunate that Commission in very limited degree has analyzed their own, so to say, stories about the Norwegianization policy. So there is a lack of analyzing. The analysis isn't present. So they don't, for example, these two pillars, they really don't discuss those two pillars. And when their descriptions in the different chapters aren't really discussed in terms of assimilation policy or the historic policy of the state. So it's descriptions about the outcome of public decisions, acts, and it is descriptions about the consequences on the indigenous Sami and the national minorities. So it's a focus on the minorities and the indigenous Sami in terms of political outcomes. But what the decision-making process. So how did they debate Norwegianization, for example, in public policy? We don't know, and that isn't discussed why they haven't done that, and they haven't discussed the methods in terms of should I say lack of analysis, or maybe just the fairly limited analysis of the descriptions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's very interesting. Yeah, please.
Maybe I also should say, since you brought up the term colonialism, so and that is a term that it's been used in the report here and there. It's not used as a perspective. So it is used as an everyday word, so to say, and it is used in terms of the state policy in agricultural colonialism, as it is called, jordbrukskolonisering in Norwegian. But they don't use the word colonialism as a scientific term. So the colonizing perspectives in terms of power, asymmetric power relations, and how the public system and the public structures were infused with the hierarchy of ethnic categories. So that isn't debated or even not explained. There's a little separate box where they sort of shortly thematize the term colonization, but it is not used as analytical tool.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's a very interesting perspective also to that you bring out, that this kind of very central concepts do not really seem to be taken into the analysis of the report, such as colonialism, and which is surely a shortcoming of the report, but an important perspective to bring out also in the aftermath of the report. I would also like to step a little bit back because you mentioned the Fosen case and ongoing wind infrastructure projects or wind energy projects in Norway. And this is, I think, in the context of the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work. The Fosen process, or the Fosen strategic litigation before the court. So I think that the Supreme Court judgment came in 2021 and wasn't implemented, as you mentioned, and was really, so this whole Fosen process was really unfolding on the same time as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was wondering if you could maybe, if you have any thoughts on that. Did that affect the Commission's work at all? And how was this the tension between the two, or this kind of paradox seen in society from your perspective?
Well, the Fosen case is mentioned in the report. It really, in my opinion, it doesn't seem to have had a huge impact on the measures that was suggested. But that is maybe debatable. I'm not going to be very, very sort of yeah. I'm not going to be too categoric, on that. So yeah, no, but it is in the report. The commission leader, as if I don't remember very wrongly, the commission leader or the commission wrote a letter to the government, to the department. I'm not quite sure which department, asking for this Fosen case and where it were and how it was going to be followed up. But that doesn't really, in my opinion, isn't really mirrored in the report as a question of how did this, how was that letter actually followed up by the commission. But I may be on thin ice because I have to check the report on this specific.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that you developed with the thoughts on this, because it's a very interesting theme and paradox that we are really following in these times, that really goes to the what you said about the first and the second pillars, also in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. I was wondering, because sometimes we talk about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions as part of a transitional justice process. From your perspective, what are the greatest limitations of truth commissions in settler states and non-transitional societies like Norway? So we don't formally have a political transition or something of the sort.
Yes, when I talk about this, or when I talk about the Norwegian, the TRC, the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I always, or I not necessarily always, but I try to bring up the both. In my opinion, I use two categories. I use the transitional, the new democracies, where there have been Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in new democracies, in contrast to old democracies or consolidated democracies, as the Norwegian and Finnish and Swedish Canada is. So when I talk about the new democracies and why, because there's a huge difference between these two ways of talk, or the goal of these commissions, because in new democracies there is a need for a transition. There's the transition is from the former state of, for example, war, dictatorship, huge violence, which affected everybody. So they have transitioned into a new democracy, and in this democracy, the whole of the population were affected of the violence or of the previous situation of war and dictatorship and so on. So huge human rights violations, violence physically and so on. Yeah. So and the aim of that kind of commissions is to establish a common understanding of what the population at large has experienced, to get the same understanding of what did we experience when it was war, what happened really with us as a collective. So it is the aim is to strengthen the new democracy and to establish the new state. So it's a new state. So it's the unity that are in the focus here, building trust and building justice for all. So in the other category where we are, the consolidated or the old democratic states, which started with the indigenous people in globally, Canada, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Australia, and so on. This isn't the situation where we have transitioned. It was the state itself, the democratic state itself, that did the harm, that decided upon the unjust and the human rights violations. So that's a huge difference in my opinion, because the population at large doesn't really need to know anything because they haven't been affected. So if they don't care to educate themselves, well, it doesn't matter for them necessarily. So it doesn't matter for them because it's not personal. So it is the minorities and the indigenous peoples that have been affected culturally, language-wise. For the indigenous people, loss of land, displacement, which the Samis in Sweden have experienced in the start of the 20th centuries, that the Samis at Fosen, in my opinion, have experienced. Not that they had to move from their own houses, but the reindeers have been displaced. At least the government have a policy that has said that they have to find new areas, grassing areas. So a sort of displacement. So displacing out of your traditional land. So I don't remember what you asked me about, but
about the limitations of truth commissions in non-transitional states, democracies like Norway. But yeah. I think, you have also answered that question.
Yeah, but I really like to emphasize also that in our model of commissions, if you listen to the debates and how you talk about, and if you listen to the Norwegian Parliament's debate and what the MPs are saying, said during the meeting, they emphasize the humanity, the therapy, the language, education, need for education, information, maybe even memories, maybe even affect what is it called, the feelings of affective
affections.
Whilst the indigenous people tend to talk about decolonization, systemic changes, land rights, to undo the unjust in terms of transformation, that the democracy itself has to look upon itself and see how was it possible that we, the democratic state, could decide upon such a policy, and why do we still see that it is still have an effect. And it is continuing, as in my opinion, you can discuss the Fosen case, for example, in that perspective. Yeah.
Indeed, thank you. So going a bit further on this topic, also discussing reconciliation in this context, and you also mentioned the upcoming budget, state budget, and that it is still a bit in the open about what the reconciliation process will look like in the aftermath of the Parliament decisions and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. So how can we ensure that reconciliation is an ongoing process and not just something that's limited to the immediate years that follow the final report? So really to ensure that process, what can be done, and how what can be done to avoid the continuation of the colonial tradition of deficient implementation of Sami rights in practice, which, for example, the Fosen case is an example of.
Reconciliation as an ongoing. Well, first of all, I would say that to ensure that the reconciliation is an ongoing process, I think you have to identify what is reconciliation. And that isn't necessarily a very straightforward concept. And before, in my opinion, that is a prerequisite, that you really have debated and that you seek to establish an understanding of what reconciliation is in the population and amongst politicians. So that is one really important point, in my opinion. So in the Norwegian in the TRC report, they chose not to seek to educate themselves in terms of how other TRCs had defined or understood the term reconciliation. So the Norwegian TRC says in the report that they have chosen to make their own interpretation of what characterizes a reconciled society in Norway, as they say. And they said that their understanding is adapted to a democratic welfare society. And however, they define or they explain reconciliation as trust, truth, and apologies. And they mention forgiveness as related to reconciliation. And that is terms that is quite difficult to concretize. It's difficult to see how can you feel reconciliation. What is reconciliation when you talk about trust, for example? What is trust? It's a huge scholar debate on that term, because you can define it in many ways. The same goes for truth. What is truth? There are many. Well, you could say that there is one truth, but in the scholarly debate there are many truths. So how can we understand reconciliation in a Norwegian context if we depart from those 4 terms? It's not that easy to sort of find the path forward to reconciliation, and that is maybe that's the problem, that the Commission didn't actually take that term and handle or debated it in a proper way. So, and that could also have been educating the public, because if you listen today, when people discuss reconciliation, it often ends up as in a harmony approach,
Mm.
as if reconciliation is harmony, and that you have to agree with your counterpart, or yeah. In my opinion, you can understand reconciliation in absolutely in as a harmony, but also as conflict, because uh, you have to sort of, in my opinion, recognize that the different parties here have different positions, have different experiences, and the asymmetrical power relations are huge in terms of political power. And then to sort of demand that one should agree upon a specific understanding, when the consequences of the Norwegianization policy has been and is so huge. That isn't really reconciliation. That is the use of power, if you really expect people to talk about reconciliation as harmony. And why do I say that? Well, I say it because the Norwegianization policy was a policy that the parliament decided upon. It was a political decision. So Norwegianization isn't something that has grown up between the majority of Norwegians and the minority of Samis and Kvæns. It was a willing, targeted policy that was decided upon, and that was implemented through many, many decades with the state funding.
Mm.
So then you have to accept that reconciliation isn't also have a political dimension. It isn't Reconciliation isn't about how the majority and how the minorities can reconcile with each other and their faith and their disagreements. It can be, but in my opinion, it is as much a political term, in terms of how can the state, how can they make politics that is reconciling? So what kind of policy can they decide upon that is just? Because the Norwegian, excuse me, I'll see if I can find it. The Norwegian name of the commission isn't the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That is just the end part, because the specific name has the term unjust in it.
Mm.
So it is the unjust that is in focus. So how do you rectify the unjust? And how do the state rectify the unjust? It's through politics. It's through decisions. But then I'm a political scientist, so I see the politics in reconciliation, and that is also because the term unjust is in the name of the commission. You can, I depart when I talk about reconciliation. I depart from different understandings of justice. When I talk about reconciliation, I talk about different perspectives of justice, and that you find in they are scientific terms, and you can use them when you analyze politics. You can use them when you analyze relations in small villages or between groups, this is tools that we can use to understand the phenomenon and see how can we move forward. How do we establish justice. Yeah.
Thank you very much for elaborating on the politics of reconciliation. And I think that also goes back very much, as you said, to this kind of lack of analysis of power symmetries and how important it is really to address those in order to maybe get a meaningful reconciliation or really to address that term at its core. Um, if the Norwegian TRC were considered successful, then what changes do you think that would mean in the everyday lives of Sami people in the coming years? So a bit more of an open question for you. Do you have any thoughts around this?
Well, I'm not I'm not quite sure how many thoughts I have, but I'll try. Well, uh, in um, in my opinion, if it were considered successful, um, I think the land rights would have been in place, Sami land rights. The Samis who are dependent of the land, the way of living would have is or will be secured, so it's not the constant threat of these economic stakeholders that are entering into the Sami traditional lands. That's one. So the clarification of the land rights, but also the implementation, and that is something that the TRC have as one of their approaches. That is the implementation gap, because we have acts, and especially concerning the Samis, but the implementation goes too slowly. We have the Education Act that secures both the Kven and the Sami the right to language education in Sami and Kven language. That there are huge challenges in terms of implementation. You can take it to the Child Welfare Act. There's a new paragraph there on the Sami children's rights, for example. Um, it's not it's it, it's not too proactive, the implementation of that. So, and you can put and you can say the same on other acts too. The implementation is a challenge. So if I should dream how it could have been, the implementation would have been automatic. When addition is done, the implementation will start. And I wish that politics, a political focus, and that we could have also get to know the foundation of political decisions, so that we could have been that we can be informed on how these regulations are used, how they are utilized by stakeholders and economic interests, and where the right holders really doesn't have the resources to participate alongside on an equal basis. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, those thoughts. And I have one final question also for you. Now, the Norwegian TRC was the first among the TRCs that look at Nordic injustices against the Sami indigenous people. Uh, uh, but so the Norwegian TRC delivered its final report in 2023. Finnish TRC delivered its final report in 2025, and the Swedish TRC is delivering its final report this year, 2026. So if we look at the bigger context in Sápmi, but maybe also other similar settler state contexts. What lessons can be learned from the Norwegian TRC that would help us to strengthen recognition, reparations, and achieve reconciliation?
Mm. Well, first of all, I would like to emphasize that the work that the TRC in Norway has done is an important and significant document. So it describes the Norwegianization policy thoroughly. There are, of course, other aspects that could have been brought into the report, but as a whole, it's a document that gives us an insight into the Norwegianization policy. So I would like to emphasize that it's an important document in that aspect. Uh, uh, I would maybe another thing that we should learn from the Norwegian TRC is maybe what shouldn't have been done. At least it should have been assessed more thoroughly, and that is the common TRC for both the indigenous Sami and the national minorities. That hasn't necessarily been a productive way, so to say. There are because several reasons actually. But the differences between the indigenous Sami and the clans and what challenges these groups are facing, that isn't, in my opinion, properly brought up, because there is, of course, when it is a common or a joint commission with different groups, there will be the writing or the understanding will maybe focus on what is common and not what is separating, and that may explain the lack of, for example, colonialism as a perspective. I have been looking into the Swedish, the Sami Swedish, the scholar report that was forwarded for a week or two since. And in my opinion, they have a much more, because these are scholars that contribute. So it's a much more analytical, much more these terms are brought up as tools, and that way of doing it, and also that they had this Meänkieli Tornedal Klan Commission that brought up the challenges that minority group has had, in my opinion. When I looked into that report, gave me a new understanding of what they, as a group, as a minority group, has experienced. So I would say that separate commissions for different minorities and indigenous peoples, in my opinion, could have given us even more lessons to learn. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have come to the end of this hour that we have with you. So thank you very much to all of the people who attended this webinar, and especially to you, Professor Eva Josefsen, for sharing your thoughts and allowing us all to learn from you.
Thank you.